In the smoky haze of a crowded diner, the silence is heavy. A man sits before a chessboard, his fingers hovering calculatingly over a knight. To the untrained eye, he appears to be a scholar, a gentleman enjoying a quiet afternoon in the heart of Harlem. But the jagged scar on the back of his head tells a different story. This is Bumpy Johnson, the man who ruled the underworld not with a shout, but with a terrifying whisper. He was the protector of the oppressed and the nightmare of the mob, a figure who turned the streets into his personal kingdom. Yet, even a king has predators waiting in the shadows. While he moved his pawns with precision, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was setting the board for a game he was never meant to win. They didn't just want an arrest. They wanted to shatter a legend. From the vibrant avenues of New York to the cold, isolating walls of Alcatraz, his journey was paved with blood, loyalty, and a defiance that shook the system. But how does a man go from being the untouchable, the Godfather of Harlem, to a forgotten number in a federal cell? The answer lies in a war where the law was just another weapon. The story of the man who would become a legend did not begin under the neon lights of New York, but in the sweltering heat of Charleston, South Carolina. Born in 1905, Ellsworth Johnson came into a world where the color of your skin dictated your destiny. In the South, survival often meant silence, eyes cast down, and stepping off the sidewalk when a white person passed. But Ellsworth was different. Even as a child, there was a fire in his eyes that refused to be extinguished. He possessed a sharp intellect and a pride that was dangerous for a young black boy in the Jim Crow era. His nickname, Bumpy, came from a slight deformation on the back of his head, a physical trait that would become his trademark. But as he grew, the name took on a different meaning. It symbolized a life that would never be smooth, a path filled with obstacles that he would either climb over or destroy. By the time he was a teenager, his refusal to bow down to the racial injustices of the South made him a target. His family, terrified that his defiance would lead to a lynching, made a desperate decision. They scraped together what little money they had and put him on a train headed north. They thought they were sending him to safety. In reality, they were sending a wolf into the wild. When Bumpy Johnson stepped off the train in Harlem, it must have felt like landing on another planet. It was the roaring 1920s, the height of the Harlem Renaissance. The air was thick with the sound of jazz, the smell of soul food, and the electric energy of a people reclaiming their identity. Here, a black man could walk with his head high, or so it seemed. But beneath the artistic glamour, Harlem was a brutal ecosystem. It was a place where poverty rubbed shoulders with opulence, where survival was a daily hustle. Young Bumpy didn't just want to survive, he wanted to conquer. He didn't have money, but he had something more valuable, a brilliant mind and a fearlessness that unnerved even hardened criminals. He didn't start at the top. He worked the streets, learning the rhythms of the neighborhood. He saw that Harlem was a city within a city, governed by its own unwritten laws. And he was a quick study. His rise truly began when he crossed paths with Madame St Clair, the legendary queen of policy. St. Clair was a force of nature, a sophisticated, dangerous woman who ran the numbers game, an illegal lottery that was the banking system of the black community. She saw something in Bumpy that others missed. While most muscle for hire were blunt instruments, Bumpy was a scalpel. He quoted Shakespeare and history books, yet he could handle a switchblade with surgical precision. St. Clair was under siege. Violent mobsters, led by the ruthless Dutch Schultz, were encroaching on Harlem, looking to take over the numbers racket. They saw the black community as easy prey, underestimating the resolve of the locals. They didn't count on Bumpy. He became St. Clair's principal enforcer, her bodyguard, and eventually, her general. This wasn't just about money. It was about territory and dignity. Bumpy revolutionized the way the game was played. He didn't just react to violence. He anticipated it. He organized the local crews, turning scattered street toughs into a disciplined army. Stories began to circulate on the street corners. Whispers of a man who would sit calmly in a diner reading a book one moment and disarm an attacker the next without breaking a sweat. He was building a reputation that was equal parts respect and terror. It was during these formative years that the duality of his character solidified. To the single mother struggling to pay rent, he was a savior who would slip a wad of cash in her hand without asking for anything in return. He ensured that the local businesses were protected from outsiders. He was a community leader in a trench coat and fedora. But to those who crossed him, he was a monster. He understood that in the underworld, kindness was often mistaken for weakness, and he could not afford to be weak. The streets of Harlem became his chessboard. While other gangsters played checkers, thinking only of the next dollar, Bumpy was thinking 10 moves ahead. He knew that brute force alone wasn't enough to hold power. You needed leverage. You needed intelligence. And most importantly, you needed the people. He cultivated a loyalty that money couldn't buy. When he walked down 125th Street, people didn't just move out of fear, they moved out of reverence. However, his rapid ascent did not go unnoticed. The police and later the Federal Bureau of Narcotics began to file reports on this articulate, dangerous man. They saw him not as a community figure, but as a growing threat to the established order. In a time when a black man with power was inherently seen as a criminal, Bumpy Johnson was painting a target on his back larger than he could imagine. By the end of the 1930s, Bumpy was no longer just an enforcer for Madame St Clair. He was becoming an entity of his own. The boy from Charleston had vanished, replaced by a man who looked at the skyline of New York and saw opportunities where others saw walls. He had carved out a space for himself with blood and wit, laying the foundation for an empire. But as he stood on the precipice of absolute power, the shadows were lengthening. The real war was just beginning, and the stakes were about to get much higher than a simple numbers game. If the early years were about survival, the 1930s and 40s were about domination. The streets of Harlem were no longer just a neighborhood. They were a battlefield, and the prize was the lucrative numbers racket. On one side stood the local black operators, fighting for their economic independence. On the other was Dutch Schultz, the beer baron of the Bronx, a man so violent and unpredictable that even his fellow mobsters feared him. Schultz looked at Harlem and saw a gold mine ripe for the taking. He unleashed a wave of terror, beating policy bankers and terrorizing shop owners. He thought fear would make them fold. He was wrong. Bumpy Johnson stepped into this chaos not as a victim, but as a tactician. He knew he couldn't match Schultz man for man or gun for gun. Instead, he waged a guerrilla war. He used the rooftops, the alleyways, and the intricate knowledge of the neighborhood to bleed Schultz's operation dry. It was a game of cat and mouse where the mouse had fangs. Bumpy organized a coalition of local bankers, creating a unified front that refused to pay tribute to the white mob. The violence was brutal, but for the first time, the people of Harlem saw someone fighting back and winning. The turning point came not with a gunshot, but with a handshake. The Italian Mafia, led by the pragmatic Charles Lucky Luciano, grew tired of Schultz's chaotic methods. They understood that business required order, not constant war. After Schultz was eliminated, a hit sanctioned by the Mafia Commission, Luciano turned his eyes to Harlem. But instead of continuing the war, he saw an opportunity. He realized that no white man could truly run Harlem without the consent of the people, and the people belonged to Bumpy. In a move that shattered the racial barriers of organized crime, Bumpy negotiated a deal with the five families. It was an unprecedented alliance. He would run the operations in Harlem, keeping the peace and managing the flow of money, while the Italians took a percentage for protection and police payoffs. This masterstroke elevated him from a local gangster to a figure of national criminal importance. He was no longer just an enforcer. He was now the Godfather of Harlem. With peace secured, Bumpy entered his golden age. He was the undisputed king of the uptown underworld. He moved through the streets like royalty, dressed in custom-tailored suits that cost more than most men made in a year. He frequented the legendary supper clubs, rubbing shoulders with celebrities, musicians, and politicians. In a segregated America, Bumpy walked into rooms where men of his color were usually serving the drinks, and he sat at the head of the table. But his power wasn't just defined by fear or money. It was defined by his complex relationship with the community. To the outside world, he was a criminal. To the people of Harlem, He was a necessary evil, perhaps even a hero. He became the bank of last resort for those who couldn't get loans. He paid for tuitions, covered rent for widows, and handed out turkeys on Thanksgiving. He funded youth programs and ensured that the streets remained safe for ordinary citizens. It was a calculated benevolence, yes, but it bought him a loyalty that the police could never break. When detectives came asking questions, the neighborhood went silent. He was a man of contradictions. He could discuss philosophy and play chess with the intellect of a grandmaster, yet he could order a hit without blinking. He was a champion of black pride, yet his empire was built on illegal gambling and, increasingly, the dangerous currents of narcotics, though he always claimed to keep the worst of it at arm's length. He became a cultural icon, a symbol of resistance against a system that was designed to keep men like him down. However, the higher he climbed, the more visible he became. His alliance with the Italians and his undeniable influence drew the gaze of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN. The FBN, led by zealots who viewed the war on drugs as a moral crusade, began to see Bumpy not just as a gangster, but as a symbol they needed to destroy. They couldn't stand the idea of a black man wielding such sophisticated power. They watched his empire expand, documenting every meeting, every handshake, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the 1940s bled into the 1950s, Bumpy Johnson seemed untouchable. He had outlived his enemies, outsmarted the law, and solidified his place on the throne. But in the world of shadows, the sun doesn't stay at its zenith forever. The very success that made him a legend was also crafting the chains that would eventually bind him. The board was set for the next phase of the game, and this time his opponent wasn't a rival gangster. It was the full weight of the United States government. The King of Harlem was about to face his greatest trial, why the early 1950s, the air in Harlem had changed. The festive energy of the Renaissance was fading, replaced by a tense vigilance. For Bumpy Johnson, the threat was no longer coming from rival gangsters or ambitious upstarts. It was coming from the sterile offices of Washington, D.C. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN, had grown tired of watching the Godfather slip through their fingers. Local charges of gambling or disorderly conduct were mere scratches on his armor. To bring down a king, they needed a weapon that carried the weight of a sledgehammer. That weapon was a conspiracy charge. The FBN knew they couldn't catch Bumpy with drugs in his hands. He was too smart, too insulated by layers of underlings. So, they changed the rules of the game. They didn't need physical evidence. They only needed voices. In 1952, the trap was sprung. Bumpy was indicted not for selling heroin directly, but for conspiring to sell it. It was a charge that relied almost entirely on the testimony of others, men who were facing long prison sentences themselves and were desperate for a deal. The trial was a spectacle, a grim theater played out in a courtroom that felt more like a slaughterhouse than a hall of justice. The prosecution paraded a string of witnesses, many of whom were known criminals and drug addicts. They pointed fingers at the Godfather of Harlem, weaving a narrative that placed him at the center of an international heroin ring. Bumpy sat stoically through it all, his eyes scanning the jury, perhaps realizing for the first time that his intellect couldn't save him from a system determined to lock him away. The defense argued fiercely, pointing out the lack of hard evidence, the inconsistencies, the obvious incentives for the witnesses to lie. But the die was cast. In the eyes of the all-white jury, Bumpy was already guilty before the first gavel fell. When the verdict was read, guilty, a gasp rippled through the courtroom, echoing all the way back to the streets of Harlem. The sentence was crushing, 15 years in a federal penitentiary. For a man who had lived as a king, this was a death sentence in slow motion. The judge didn't just want to punish him. He wanted to erase him. The transfer to prison was the final indignity. Bumpy was stripped of his tailored suits, his diamond rings, and his dignity. He was shackled and put on a transport that would take him as far away from his kingdom as possible. His destination was not just any prison. It was Alcatraz, the Rock. Sitting ominously in the freezing waters of the San Francisco Bay, It was the end of the line for America's most hardened criminals. It was a place designed to break the human spirit. Arriving at Alcatraz, Bumpy Johnson ceased to be the ruler of the underworld. He became inmate number 1117. The transition was brutal. The damp cold of the bay seeped into his bones, a constant reminder of his isolation. The cell was a tiny concrete box, a stark contrast to the penthouse views and velvet rope clubs he was used to. Here, there were no lieutenants to bark orders at, no admirers seeking favors. There was only the sound of the wind howling against the walls and the rhythmic clanging of steel bars. Yet, even in this concrete tomb, Bumpy refused to crumble. The other inmates, some of the most dangerous men in the country, watched him closely. They expected the dandy from New York to break under the pressure of the strict regimen and the psychological torture of silence. But Bumpy surprised them. He carried himself with the same quiet intensity he had displayed in the diners of Harlem. He didn't fight with fists unless he had to. He fought with his mind. He spent his hours in a library, devouring books on law, philosophy, and history. He played chess, visualizing the board in his mind when he didn't have a partner. He wrote poetry, verses that captured the pain of confinement and the longing for home. Rumors even swirled that he helped organize a sit-down strike within the prison walls, a subtle flex of his leadership skills, even in chains. He was serving time, but he refused to let time serve him. Back in Harlem, the streets mourned. Without Bumpy's iron grip, the order he had maintained began to fracture. The Italian Mafia tightened their hold, and the drug trade, the very thing Bumpy was accused of controlling, spiraled out of control, flooding the neighborhood with a poison that would devastate generations. The protector was gone, and the wolves were at the door. For Bumpy, the years at Alcatraz were crucible. He watched his prime years slip away through the bars, missing the childhood of his daughter, missing the changing tides of the world outside. The civil rights movement was exploding. Leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were rising, and he was stuck on a rock in the Pacific, a relic of a bygone era. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics had succeeded in removing him from the board, but they had failed to break his spirit. As he stared out at the fog-covered bay, Bumpy Johnson wasn't planning his retirement. He was planning his return. He knew that if he survived this hell, he would walk back into Harlem not just as a man, but as a martyr. The king was down, but the game wasn't over. In 1963, the heavy steel doors of Alcatraz slammed shut behind him for the last time. Bumpy Johnson returned to New York, but the city he found was not the one he had left. The jazz-infused elegance of the Harlem Renaissance had given way to the turbulent, angry energy of the 1960s. The streets were louder, the desperation was more visible, and the community was fractured. He was 57 years old, his hair turned gray, his heart weakened by years of confinement, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He walked back into Harlem like a ghost returning to a haunted house, greeted with a mixture of awe and curiosity. To the younger generation, he was a myth come to life. They had heard the stories from their parents, stories of the man who stood up to Dutch Schultz, the man who kept the Italian Mafia at bay. But to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, he was simply an unfinished job. They watched his return with cynical eyes, convinced that the old man would slip back into his old ways. They were right, but they underestimated how the game had changed. Bumpy didn't just return a crime. He returned to a community in crisis. The heroin trade, which he was accused of orchestrating, had exploded in his absence, turning blocks of Harlem into open-air drug markets. While he resumed control of the numbers rackets to survive, there was a visible shift in his demeanor. He reconnected with old friends, including a fiery minister named Malcolm X. Their relationship baffled the press and the police, the gangster and the revolutionary. Yet, they shared a common understanding. The system was rigged, and power was the only language it respected. The world watched in 1965 when Bumpy Johnson staged an act of defiance that no one expected from a career criminal. Tired of the constant police harassment that followed his release, surveillance cars parked outside his home, officers raiding his favorite dining spots, he decided to fight back. But he didn't use guns. He used the tactics of the civil rights movement. He marched into a police station and refused to leave. He staged a sit-down strike, charging the police with harassment. It was a surreal moment for America. Here was the Godfather of Harlem, a man with a rap sheet as long as his arm, sitting stoically in a precinct demanding his civil rights. The newspapers went wild. It blurred the lines between villain and victim. Was he an unrepentant mobster, or was he a black man being persecuted by a predominantly white law enforcement agency? For a brief moment, the narrative flipped. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the local police looked like bullies, and Bumpy looked like the underdog. It was a masterclass in public perception, proving that his intellect was still his most dangerous weapon. However, the admiration of the streets couldn't stop the inevitable. The FBN was relentless. They were building a new case, determined to send him back to prison for the rest of his life. They squeezed his associates, tapped his phones, and shadowed his every move. The pressure was suffocating. Bumpy knew the walls were closing in. He confided in close friends that he would never go back to prison. He had survived Alcatraz, but he knew his heart couldn't survive another cage. Internationally, the story of Bumpy Johnson began to resonate as a uniquely American tragedy. Observers from outside looked at his life and saw the failures of the American dream for black citizens. He was a man of immense talent and leadership potential who, blocked by the racial barriers of his time, found his only outlet in the underworld. He was a king in a kingdom built on sand. As 1968 approached, the atmosphere in the country was reaching a boiling point with the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the subsequent riots. In the middle of this firestorm stood Bumpy, a relic of the old code of honor, trying to maintain order in a world that was spinning out of control. He was tired. The years of fighting poverty, fighting the mob, fighting the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, fighting for his place in history, had taken their toll. He remained a beloved figure to the end, not because he was a saint, but because he was theirs. In a country that often told the people of Harlem they were nothing, Bumpy walked with the swagger of a man who knew he was everything. He was the protector who had become the prey, the predator who had become the patriarch. As the summer of 1968 dawned, the Lion of Harlem prepared for his final rest, leaving behind a legacy that was as complicated, dark, and undeniable as the city itself. The end did not come with the roar of a gunshot or the slam of a gavel. It came in the quiet hours of the morning on July 7th, 1968, at the Wells restaurant in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson was enjoying a simple meal, chicken legs, hominy grits, and coffee, surrounded by the people he had spent a lifetime leading. He was 62 years old. Suddenly, he clutched his chest and collapsed. The man who had survived gang wars, assassination attempts, and the crushing isolation of Alcatraz was finally taken down by his own heart. He died in the arms of his childhood friend, Junie Bird, passing away just moments before the ambulance arrived. In a twist of fate that Bumpy himself might have appreciated, he died a free man. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics had been preparing a new indictment, ready to drag him back into the legal arena. But the Godfather made his exit before they could serve the papers. He had outmaneuvered them one last time. He left this world not as a prisoner, but as the undisputed ruler of his domain. His funeral was a testament to the complex legacy he left behind. Thousands of people lined the streets of Harlem, climbing onto rooftops and hanging out of windows just to catch a glimpse of the hearse. To the authorities, a criminal had died. But to the weeping grandmothers and the young men, standing in respectful silence, a protector had fallen. They didn't mourn the drug dealer. They mourned the man who had paid their rent, fought for their dignity, and stood tall when the rest of the world wanted them to kneel. Today, the legend of the Godfather of Harlem remains a polarizing chapter in American history. Was he a hero who filled the void left by a negligent system? Or was he a villain who poisoned his own community with narcotics? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in the gray, much like the man himself. He was a product of a segregated America, a brilliant mind forced into the shadows, a king without a castle. Bumpy Johnson proved that you could lock a man in a cage, strip him of his name, and exile him to a rock in the ocean, but you could never truly break a spirit forged in the fires of Harlem. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about justice, survival, and the thin line between a criminal and a revolutionary. When the music fades and the chessboard is put away, one truth remains. Bumpy didn't just play the game. He changed it forever. What do you think? Was Bumpy Johnson a victim of his time or a villain of his own making? If this story made you see the line between good and evil differently, share your thoughts in the comments below. And for those who have ever had to fight just to be heard, we see you.